All right, welcome everyone. I'm Debbie Cox-Bolton, CEO of the New Deal, and really thrilled to welcome you to what is our second in a series we're doing on Democracy 2021. We started the series last time with a survey of voting right legislation around the country and efforts underway to suppress the vote. And we will be returning to that topic later this fall, as well as working on things like redistricting and other important topics. As many of you know, the New Deal is a national network of state and local elected officials around the country who are forward-thinking, results-oriented, and we're so proud to work with them right now on topics that will help us build back better post-pandemic and create an America that works better for everyone. But the bedrock of the American experience is our democracy. And if we don't get that right, we can't get much else right. So that is why we launched this series. And we're so excited today to be having a really important and timely conversation about some of the experimentation that's going on around the country in terms of voting systems and how we elect our representatives. Obviously, this is in the news and is timely because of what's going on in New York with the ranked choice voting effort there in their elections. And we're thrilled today to have three great speakers with us, experts on this topic, to help us understand what's happening around the country, what are some of these experiments looking like, and what do they mean for things like representation and really making democracy work well. So we'll be hearing from three speakers today. First is Maria Perez. She is the co-director of Democracy Rising. She's a national expert on ranked choice voting and the intersection of democracy and equity. We'll be hearing from Richie. He is the co-founder and president and CEO of FairVote, a leading advocate for voting reforms, and the author of Every Vote Equal and Whose Votes Count. And finally, we'll be hearing from, actually not necessarily in this order, but we'll also be hearing from Mayor Tishaura Jones, longtime New Deal leader, new mayor of St. Louis, Missouri. And in her historic election earlier this year, she won that election in a system called approval voting, which we'll hear more about. So really, again, excited to thank you all three for being with us and for helping lead this really important conversation. I'm looking forward to hearing about what's working around the country. And to moderate the conversation today, I'm thrilled to turn it over to my colleague, Jonathan Dworkin, who is our Vice President for Policy and Communications. Jonathan.
Well, thank you, Debbie. Welcome to all the New Deal leaders, staff, and our partners. It's great to be with you. As Debbie outlined, we are thrilled to have a fantastic set of panelists for this discussion on voting reform, which just could not be more timely. We are in the midst of probably, as Debbie was alluding to, the highest profile use of ranked choice voting in the United States. And of course, as many folks are aware of, we are actually today awaiting for more results from the election out of New York City. So I look forward to using our time today to dig into why reforms are being pursued, what makes them work, and what the challenges are. I hope that you all attending will use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to participate in the discussion with questions and comments. So with that, we should just dive right in. I want to get started with Mayor Jones, who just went through an election using I guess what I would say, non-traditional new system. Mayor, your election involved a different type of voting than what was used in New York, but one that still allowed voters to select multiple candidates, called approval voting. Hoping that you can just talk a little bit about what approval voting is, how it worked, and just what difference kind of this new system made in your election. And just thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me. Again, I'm Mayor Tishaura Jones, and I am the mayor of the city of St. Louis. I'm the first Black woman elected mayor. And as you all just heard, I'm the first mayor elected in the city of St. Louis under a new voting system called approval voting that was implemented by the voters last fall. It was an initiative petition that they voted on called Proposition D. Approval voting, for those who aren't familiar, is a system in which voters can pick as many candidates as they want in the primary election. And then the top two candidates who earn the most votes then advance to the general election. So in my case, there were 4 people on the ballot for primary, 3 Democrats and 1 Republican, but it was nonpartisan. And if you wanted to vote for all four, you could pick all four. If you only wanted to vote for one, you could pick one, and so forth and so on, or two. So since the day of my historic election, we've had plenty of opportunity to evaluate this new system. And in St. Louis, a pre-existing ordinance which required a nonpartisan candidates to gather signatures to be on the ballot applied to all races for city level positions or municipal positions. And for the mayor's race, we had to come up with just shy of 1,200 unique signatures. Because our elections are nonpartisan, we had the benefit of running not by party affiliation, but rather our ideas and values, and ensuring that those points resonated with voters when we knocked on doors and made calls. We could still identify by our party if we wanted to. And during the debates, you could pretty much tell who was a Democrat and who was a Republican, even though we weren't required to disclose that information. However, this no longer meant that the winner of the primary automatically went on to become the next mayor or alderperson, because we had about 14 alder people who were also on the ballot. Actually 16, half of our board of aldermen and another 2 special elections. We had an additional 4 weeks to campaign after the primary. So that left the winner, in this case, me, to transition to office in less than 2 weeks' time, rather than the traditional 6 weeks. We also had several races where the winner flipped from 4 weeks earlier. So there are a few new challenges and opportunities we had to face under this new system. Make no mistake, I firmly believe in new and innovative voting reforms that actually give voters the best opportunity to choose the leader they identify with. I was an early adopter and endorser of approval voting and still believe that it has merit. With any new changes, though, we must recognize that they may not be perfect from the get-go, but we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good. We can always adjust, learn from one another as we reform our voting systems in other parts of the country. So my biggest takeaway from this new voting system comes down to one word: education. There were some amazing efforts led by various organizations to inform the voters about this new process, but it's our mandate to continue to educate people so they'll know how to make the system work for them. We need everyone to know how to register, how to file for office, how to run for office, and how to vote. St. Louis's next big municipal election is in 2023 and will be accompanied by redistricting that cuts the number of the Board of Aldermen in half from 28 to 14. So I look forward to seeing this new system in action and how we can continue to learn from it and educate others about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And just one, before I move on to Rob and Maria, and we'll pivot to also bringing in the ranked choice voting. Could you just talk a little bit more about what happened between the fact that there was the primary and then this basically runoff, am I correct, in the general election, and the fact that you decided to have this new kind of system, but what it did was it funneled you down to 2 candidates, right? And then you ended up getting to win with 50% plus 1 or more of the vote. And just if your evaluation, if that was a good way to do it, to have the approval voting first and then have a one-on-one race for the winner.
Well, for the viewers there, I think I'm a little unique here in that this is my second time running for mayor. So I ran in 2017 and we had a partisan election then, and we had 7 candidates and 5 Black, 2 white, and we split the vote. We split the Black vote, the Black and progressive vote. And so I remember a lot of people saying to me after that election was that they wished that there was a top 2 runoff. And so with Prop D or approval voting, we did get a top 2 runoff, but I got more than 56% of the approval in the first round. And so there's been discussion on, if you get more than 50% approval or a certain threshold, should you even have a runoff? Because we saw that, I won 4 weeks later, still with even with 52% of the vote in the runoff. But also we saw that people who had the most approval votes in the primary sometimes lost the general. And there were a couple of races on the automatic side where there were two people running in the primary, and then those same two people got another chance to campaign an extra 4 weeks and run again in the general. And we saw about 3 seats flip because they had 4 additional weeks to campaign. So, I mean, I don't know, I guess there's some merit there with having sort of 2 shots or 2 bites at the apple, so to speak, with, getting more education and information out into the communities about like what this election meant for those particular wards. But still, I think that we need to try to tweak it to make sure that that people's voices are still being heard, and that we can increase turnout, because our turnout was still dramatically low. It was still less than 30% of the people showed up in both elections.
Well, thank you for that perspective. And I want to come back to some of those points you were just making as we continue, but also want to bring in our 2 experts on ranked choice voting, which is another alternative, I guess I'll call, form of voting. And of course, probably most well known now because of the New York City election last week. And of course, we've got the results still ongoing. So I want to bring on our 2 experts on that, Maria Perez and Rob Richie. And Rob, why don't I start with you, because I do want to dig into what happened in New York in more detail and what we can learn from that. But if we could just start at a higher level on the ranked choice voting system. Could you just briefly address why you feel like reform is needed, what ranked choice voting is, and why you are advocating for it as the answer?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jonathan. And it'll be a nice compliment with Maria, because she does direct outreach in communities, lots of coordination of voter education and candidate education, and it's great stories to tell about how that works in practice, which also was a big role of what happened in New York. So we'll touch on that on a high level, but it's an unfolding, very good story. So ranked choice voting is a pretty simple principle, which is that if you only have a single choice and you have more than 2 candidates, that's not allowing you as a voter to say as much as you want to, right? So that it's if there's 3 choices, 4 choices, 5 choices, if you just vote for one, you're not able to say anything about the other 3 or 4 or whatever it is candidates. And that changes how campaigns campaign, how voters engage with candidates. And if you give voters an opportunity to say who their backup choice and who their third choice is, that 1, it makes it more likely their vote will count, and 2, kind of changes that relationship between candidate and voter in a very meaningful way. The difference between approval voting and ranked choice voting in a simple way is that approval voting, the votes count at the same time. In ranked choice, those second and third preferences are backups. So your vote, you go all in with your first choice, and your ballot only goes to your second choice as a backup, as sort of like, okay, well, my first choice can't win, rats. Okay, now I'll settle on my second choice, my compromise. And that invites people to use it more, to use their rankings. And Maria will be able to talk a little about Santa Fe, where like, hey, 60% of people ranked every mayoral candidate running in a 5-candidate race and things like that. So what you do is you add up all the first choices. If you have a first round majority winner, person gets over half the votes, you're done, because you're trying to see which candidate is the most representative candidate wins more than half when you're just electing one person. But if there's no majority winner, that's when the backups kick in. So the candidate who trails the field in last place is eliminated. Their ballots are added to those voters' backup choice, their second choice. You kind of rinse and repeat until you get down to 2 and you have this quote unquote instant runoff. We will see this in New York City, actually in a few hours. They're going to finally run the tally. We already know some really important things from New York City. So New York City was actually in a similar position what Mayor Jones talked about. It has partisan elections. So this is what St. Louis used to have. It has partisan elections where the parties nominate this month, and then they'll have a general election, with partisan nominees in November. It's a Democratic majority city. So these Democratic primaries are seen as decisive in most contests. What was exciting from an impact perspective is that turnout has risen more than 25% from the last open seat race back in 2013, actually probably the highest Democratic mayoral number of votes since way back in the 80s. And even with the challenges of COVID and the impact on campaigning, you're seeing a really reflection of the changing of New York playing out with the system. You had a whole new face of mayoral candidates, a city that's only had one non-white male be mayor in its whole history, had more than 90% of votes went to non-white male candidates. The council, which has never been more than a third women, and it's only a quarter women today, is going to be a majority, super majority women, and actually about half will be women of color. And a lot of the city's diversity reflected by all the different countries of origin that people come from will have this different representation and voice. The folks on the ground, Common Cause New York and Rank the Vote NYC, and this whole really exciting coalition that led the efforts around implementation. One thing they did was an exit survey, and that came out yesterday. 95% found it an easy way to vote. 77% say they prefer it to their old system. More than 80% said they ranked in the mayoral race. Probably they're ranked in all these down ballot races that were a lot of exciting down ballot races. And more than 40% said they used all 5 of their rankings. And in New York City, they limit rankings to 5, but that, almost half said that they ranked used all their rankings. And that was really reflected, I think, by a lot of the ways that the candidates campaigned. Again, it's, I think, as Mayor Jones said, we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for improvement and betterness. And I think, but it did a lot of things that are better. I think one thing that ranked choice voting is a selling point, I'll sort of stop here, is that it does different things. Like partisan elections, it kind of handles the third party impact. Presidential primaries handles those big crowded fields and deals with some of the problems that can happen with that. In these nonpartisan races, what it is generally done wherever it's being used around the country is it allows you to fold 2 elections into one. So Mayor Jones talked about, having 2 different elections, and there's some pros to that, but there's sort of cons for cost and the burden on the candidates and campaign finance systems and so on. So pretty much every city that's gone to it, and we're up to about 50 now, including 23 in Utah alone, are going to use ranked choice voting this November, from Salt Lake to a lot of smaller communities. They folded 2 elections into one, and ranked choice voting is a way to pretty reliably getting a good representative candidate win in one round, so people can really focus their energy and their sort of civic energy and participation in one election.
Rob, thank you for that. So much to digest there, and want to dig in a little bit more. I think, one of the things I wanted to ask Maria about, want to bring you into the conversation, was some of the challenges with implementing this. And I think the mayor and Rob have hit on the voter education piece of this. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how to make that effective, and where you think it's working, and do you feel like, it sounds like from what Rob said, people feel like it worked in New York? What's your reaction to that?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Rob, for that intro. It makes my work a lot easier. I think that as far as voter education goes, that is something that my Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, said at one point when the city of Santa Fe was implementing that voter education really is something that should be happening 365 days out of the year. But unfortunately, that is really not the case in most jurisdictions. Voters don't really pay attention to the fact that there's an election coming up until about 2 months or so before said election. And there's not a whole lot of funding, a whole lot of investment in voter education year round. So it tends to be really connected to election cycles where voters get bombarded with information. And then, the rest of the year, a couple years, sometimes there's just not much there. So I think I've been working on educating voters on ranked choice voting for several years now. And something that I see is in jurisdictions where there's forethought about this, and where there's early investment in voter education, of course, the results are better, right? New York City, for example, Common Cause and Rank the Vote NYC, they started doing voter education and candidate education about a year ago, right before election day. Candidate trainings are incredibly important because with a system like ranked choice voting, of course, candidates are incentivized to reach out to as many voters as possible, not just those undecided voters, but a broad base of voters. So, in all truth, voters are going to be hearing about ranked choice voting from the candidates and their campaigns themselves. So making sure that candidates understand what ranked choice voting is, how it works, and importantly, how to talk to people about it. Not getting into the weeds about tabulation and algorithms and this and that, but rather just, connect with voters about values, about, your power as a voter to have a little nuance in the way that you're voting. You can rank the candidates in order of preference. If your favorite candidate doesn't have enough popular support to win, your vote still will count for your next choice candidate, and such things, right? So having candidates and campaigns on board, educating the voters is really super important. Voters are really gonna be hearing from candidates and campaigns more than anybody else, really. And so if that work can happen early on an election cycle or year round even, that is really important. Another thing that I'd like to say about voter education is the importance of connecting with organizations on the ground in whichever jurisdiction is going to be implementing. There are a number of community orgs in every jurisdiction that may or may not have anything to do with voting or elections, but who are interested in making sure that voters are well educated, that voters turn out, and that voters express their views and their voice. So, in the work that I've done in a number of jurisdictions, I've partnered with, environmental justice organizations, transit justice organizations, service organizations that serve very specific communities as far as ethnicity goes, or as far as, the blind community or the deaf community. So partnering with those organizations is key, because each one of those organizations already has a membership base or a constituency that they already know how to reach to, they already know how to talk to, they already know what needs to be done to make sure that those folks have information that's going to be important for them to be able to interact with their ballot appropriately. So it's about voter education. Really is about getting creative. It's about forming a broad coalition of unlikely partners where everybody's goal really is to make sure that voters are informed, that voters turn out, and that voters know how to interact with their ballot. The more the merrier, right? The jurisdiction itself cannot do all the work. The candidates themselves cannot do all the work. So it's really a coalition thinking around voter education.
Thank you. And as we continue, I want to just encourage folks to use the Q&A function. Please feel free to put in some questions and comments that we can discuss with the panelists. And I see, one of those, which I think makes sense to go to next in terms of thinking about some of the challenges maybe that we're trying to solve with these systems. And I'll go to Mayor Jones, who I see had a good comment on this already, which is how's campaigning in these systems affected in terms of more positive, more negative? It sounds like, there's some sense from Maria, from Rob, that maybe in the ranked choice election, hopefully you see more positive campaigning. And Mayor, wondering from you, if there was a difference in that between the primary and the general, and why, you feel like the runoff was so challenging, and if there's a way to address that.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that happened in the primary was there was a candidate who had run twice before for mayor, who was running for a third time, who's very popular, who's our current president of the Board of Aldermen or our city council. And he raised, a lot of money, and everyone just knew that he was going to make it to the top two. And what happened was we saw a shift, and he didn't win any wards. And came in third place to a person who was on the Board of Aldermen, who then I ran against in the runoff. And so it was myself, and then this person who was on the city council, who was a white woman. And the one unfortunate thing that I hope did not happen happened in the runoff, which it came down to race. There were a lot of subtle dog whistles being blown by the opposition, calling my family a political dynasty, being concerned that St. Louis would turn into East St. Louis, which is, for those who don't know, East St. Louis is just across the river from St. Louis. It's in Illinois, and is a town that is a victim of white flight. It used to be an all-white town, and now it's not anymore. But comparisons there, and it turned really, really negative. Where the voting system, the change in the voting system was supposed to have us campaign on the issues and let voters decide who was more closely aligned with their issues, their morals, their values, and things that they care about. But I didn't return any of the fire. I just stayed on message, let the voters know what I was capable of, what my experience was as being a citywide elected office holder for 8 years. And fortunately, I was victorious.
Do you think that just from your experience that there would be a better way to have run the election that would have improved the voter experience maybe, or is this just, part and parcel of what we're dealing with now and there's no way to get around it?
I think it's part and parcel, and that sort of thing happens during campaigns. Actually, we wanted ranked choice voting as our voting system, but that would have required a cost to reprogram our voting machines, and we currently just didn't have it. That doesn't mean that we couldn't in the future, because again, as I talked about in my opening remarks, that shrunk the transition time from 6 weeks to 2 weeks. And there's also some additional reporting requirement that was required by my campaign staff, who was excellent, by the way. But, it required some more reporting that had to be turned in literally the day before I was inaugurated. So there were some of the cons to that system, but I guess in the end, people got a chance to vote for the people that they thought would lead our city in the right direction.
Rob, maybe just following up on the point about, negative versus positive campaigning. I think this is something that's been brought up quite a bit by folks in favor of the ranked choice model. Wondering if you can comment on that a little bit in the case of the New York election. And specifically, we saw two of the considered front-running candidates campaigning against each other, or campaigning with each other, excuse me, kind of down the stretch of the campaign. Is that something that, is a sign that the system is working? Is that a good thing, something that you want to see, or is that, something strange?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, nothing should be overstated. You still have candidates, they still want to win, they have campaign consultants. So we're not talking about sort of this complete change from every kind of politics that we know. But I will say that it does change incentives in some important ways. One thing I should say in relation to what Mayor Jones was saying about St. Louis is that New York City, for its former citywide primaries before they went to ranked choice voting, did have runoff elections. And, you would get a one-on-one race, but it was really expensive. If it wasn't mayor, turnout would just really plunge, and the pattern was really negative, right? So Tish James is now the Attorney General of New York, but she first won citywide in New York in a runoff and just became a big fan of ranked choice voting because it was just, she won, but it's just such a brutal experience that it's like, I don't want other people to have to go through that. And I think that you still saw in this New York mayoral race, you still saw candidates being comparative, and the debates were sharp elbowed and making distinctions, because you do need to win in first choices. But here's what's different. And in some ways, we'll see this play out. So New York, I'm not sure if I was clear about this earlier, the voting took place last Tuesday. A lot of absentee ballots still being counted, but a lot of votes have been counted. We see first choices. They're only going to run ranked choice voting tallies today. So we'll learn a lot more about how things really play out later this afternoon. A lot of jurisdictions that have ranked choice voting now get it done in the same day, like Santa Fe, where Maria is from. They get it done on the night of election. Minneapolis, San Francisco starts doing ranked choice voting tallies quickly. New York's kind of getting ready, first election, wanted to make sure they got it right. But so in the mayor's race, no one has more than a third of the vote. And so at this point in time, among the top 3 candidates, it's going to come down to not only being in the top 3 in first choices, but how you did in reaching out and being second and third. And it's very clear that one of the candidates is going to get in the final 2, but it's not even clear for sure who the final candidate against that person is going to be. So being nimble, being ready to pick up backup choices, and having established that you can make common ground with people, you can find something that's appealing to their voters, can make you win or lose. So it changes the incentive to be more positive. When it's binary choice, one-on-one, it's zero-sum politics, you don't have that same incentive. So I think that's the thing that we're starting to see play out. And there's measurable, academic evidence that you see, candidate behavior changing, again, not night and day, but just in a positive direction. And certainly voter experience of the elections is changing to be one where they feel more engaged with and listened to.
Thank you. I want to turn to a couple questions from New Deal leaders I see coming in. And Maria, maybe I'll start with you on this first one, but other folks should feel free to jump in. Have you experienced state and local political party resistance to the ranked choice model specifically? And, how have those jurisdictions worked to overcome that resistance?
So there is definitely some resistance from political parties that I've experienced in different places. I think that, it's human nature, right? The way of voting that got you elected is the correct way for people. They don't want to see change happen because maybe they wouldn't have gotten elected that way. Additionally, I think because we have this really entrenched 2-party system, it's kind of like a yin and yang situation where it works for the other party. It works just to have one more party, and changing the way that we do politics, changing the way that we do elections, kind of shifts power, the way that power is achieved and held onto. And for that reason, I have encountered some mistrust or lack of support from some party operatives. But I actually feel like that is changing as more and more jurisdictions adopt different voting systems, like ranked choice voting, that really allow for voters to participate more fully. So I think that the thing about ranked choice voting is that, and in other voting methods, right? If the rules of the game are more fair and more friendly to those folks who are playing the game, in this case, the voters, then things are going to turn out better. Democracy is stronger, and for elected officials to have a strong mandate, a majority of the vote, and those sort of things really make for a stronger democracy. So even though there has been and there continues to be some resistance, I do feel that is changing, and I do hope that will be changing quickly enough as we see places, like Utah and Alaska adopting ranked choice voting, that it's not just left-leaning places that are adopting it. It's not just something that is something that Democrats like, right? Democrats, Republicans, Independents, everybody can benefit from this. Voters benefit from this.
Maybe I'll just add one point that ranked choice voting can be used in a variety of ways. So I think we shouldn't address almost the viability of it for every contest the same. Pretty much every city that has passed it, the great majority, it's actually come through either the city council or a charter commission that the city council appointed, like in New York. It's now, there's been 4 states where the legislature this year passed a bill that advanced ranked choice voting. One was just signed yesterday by the governor of Colorado. Not sweeping change, but pushing. We had the Virginia Republican Party choose voluntarily to use ranked choice voting to nominate their candidates for statewide office. They had 7 Republicans running for governor, and they wanted to handle that well. And they actually thought running the contest through the state-run primary would be a problem because you get a lot more voters, but you'd have to handle a plurality outcome, and they wanted to get a more representative outcome. So they ran their own ranked choice voting contest and felt really positive about it. We had 4 states that where the Democratic state parties last year used ranked choice voting in presidential primaries. So you get like those kinds of uses. I think once there's a certain kind of tire kicking that goes on and a kind of comfort level, that I think we can see a lot more use of it. We do have 2 states that now are using it for presidential primaries. Presidential general elections and US Senate, US House races, Alaska and Maine. And so I think it's now kind of getting to that level of consideration, but that's where the pushback, the pressure and the kind of the, are we doing the right thing kind of considerations kick in. Last thing I'll comment, there was a, I think, thoughtful question from Jeff Bridges in chat, which is about this climate we're in where confidence in outcomes and the clarity of outcomes, helping to reassure people that they can move forward into serving. And I think that that's a serious need for the ranked choice voting community to kind of make sure that this is accepted. I think the work that Maria and others like her do on the ground with voter education, candidate education, is all part of normalizing this. And I think if that doesn't happen, you're creating troubles for yourself. But I think we'll want to get it to normalize so that results are faster, and it doesn't have to be fast the very first time, but let's get there. And I think what I've seen also is that you have one round of getting used to it. The ballot looks different, the results look different, and people are like, whoa, and then use it again. It's like, oh, it becomes normal. And so it actually pretty quickly gets normal, but there is a transition cost that you have to just accept.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see if in the future out of New York and some of these other places, I think already do it, you get full results more immediately than we're getting this time. And if that might be more satisfying to people. I want to turn to a separate point that I think is an interesting question about a challenge and whether these systems address it in terms of our current system or transitioning to a new system if this is helped. I think one of the things that we at New Deal hope that any election or voting reforms would solve is to improve representation of underrepresented groups like minorities and women. And I guess I mean that in 2 ways. First, having their interests better represented in the halls of power, and of course that we have more diversity in elected office. And I do want to get Rob and Maria's thoughts on this, but I think, Mayor, maybe it makes sense to start with you. I think you alluded to this in your opening comments, and you just won an inspiring historic victory to become the first Black woman to lead your city. How do you see, in your case, approval voting's impact on improving representation in all of these ways?
Well, I absolutely think it improved representation. Even though, like I said, the runoff got really negative, there were still 2 women who were running in the runoff to become mayor. So I think that was a huge win for representation, that the voters spoke, that they wanted to continue to see a woman leading in this office because my predecessor was also a woman. And it just came down to who the voters thought that would represent their interests better and actually get the job done. So I think that was a huge win for a change in our election system. And both of the men in the race came in 3rd and 4th place respectively.
Maybe we could also have Maria and then Rob comment on that as well. And if you're seeing anything with where ranked choice has been implemented so far, if this issue in terms of underrepresentation is being addressed.
I mean, what I see in jurisdictions that have implemented ranked choice voting, and sometimes this happens after one election cycle, and sometimes it takes a few cycles, but governing bodies get younger, they get browner, they get more female across the board. So, I mean, if you look at, for example, in Las Cruces, New Mexico, I think, the average age on the city council dropped probably by 20 years. All of a sudden there was a majority Latino council, majority female council for the first time. So, and that was after one cycle. If we look at the Minneapolis City Council governing body, before ranked choice voting, it was a very non-diverse governing body. It was mostly all white and like older and maler. And now it's one of the most diverse councils that we have in the country. And I think that if we look at New York City also, for a diverse city as New York City is, the council, the governing body, has been tremendously undiverse. And I think we're going to see a huge change in that just with this one election cycle. I think the benefit of a system like ranked choice voting is that as a candidate, if you are brave enough to run, and if you have a vision for your community, you can throw your hat in. Nobody's going to tell you to drop out. Nobody's going to tell you to wait your turn because you're not, you don't have a machine strong enough behind you. You can be a young organizer of color in your community, and if you have sort of like an organizing machine behind you that's very grassroots, you can run and you could possibly be viable and win. So I think that really is one of the most outstanding powers of a system like ranked choice voting, is that it allows for community leaders who have a vision, who want to run for office, to be able to do it without anybody telling them they need to drop out or wait their turn, in a sort of like a white supremacist way. You can do it. If you have a vision, you can do it, and you possibly can win.
Yeah, it was interesting to see, in the run-up to the New York election, that it seemed like there was some concern being expressed by folks like at the NAACP and others representing minority groups that there would be this could be damaging to their interests and the voter turnout would be down. That seems to be unfounded. Rob, would love for you to weigh in on this. And wondering also, a lot of the places that we're talking about are already more progressive places. Can this work in a positive way in terms of representation in maybe some less progressive places?
Yeah, I think it's the evidence on the ground is really strong, sort of backing up all the things that Maria was saying. There's a group called Represent Women, which looks at systemic rules that affect representation of women. They've looked at all the ranked choice voting elections, who's in them now, and women hold half of mayoral seats and half of city council races. Actually, after today, or when New York people are seated, I think that'll grow to more than half. And that, by the way, women are going to double their representation on city council in New York in one fell swoop, not just because of ranked choice voting, but I think it helps, it goes hand in hand with a climate of, as Maria said, you can run, no one should tell you not to run. And I think having more choice and just having more faces for change contributes to that. And those positive incentives where I think some of the dog whistle politics that can sort of tap into things can stifle change. But in the Bay Area, there's 53 offices elected by ranked choice voting. Before they had it, about 2 out of 5 were held by people of color, and now it's 3 out of 5 out of all those races. And the 4 mayors were all white men. Now none of them are white men. It's not like white men are bad, but it just is change is coming, and it's being reflected in these outcomes. There was a report that we did on our website about sort of a very deep dive into how voters of color and candidates of color are handling ranked choice voting, and very encouraging. And I think addressing those issues that were raised by some in New York, not many. I think, when it passed, the vote yes in New York City was higher among African Americans than among any other racial group. And I think their use of rankings this week is going to be sort of reassuring on that ground too. I will say one last thing is that one conversation to happen. I'll say 2 last things. So one is to address your question about can it win in different places, and what's its impact like. So Rebecca Chavez-Houck is on this call. She's a former state legislator of Utah, and there's been just this remarkable progress in Utah toward using and considering ranked choice voting that she's played a central role in, working very closely with Republicans who are interested in it as well. And so these 23 cities using it had to be approved. It had to be established by the state legislature to let them do this. And then a lot of consideration in conservative leaning areas and liberal leaning areas. So Salt Lake is using ranked choice voting, but some smaller communities in very conservative areas. And I think there's a very positive, let's do this kind of feeling that really is across the board. So we'll see what the impact is in a much bigger way there this year. I'll also add that, the Virginia Republicans, there's a number of states where, southern states, so they use ranked choice voting in runoff elections for overseas voters, kind of a very precise use of it, but it also is one that shows the mechanism can make sense. The last point I did want to make was that the conversation we still can have in communities in particular, and maybe at a higher level, we're hoping it goes up higher, is winner take all versus a fair representation proportional system. And ranked choice voting can be used hand in hand with multi-member districts. Some cities do that today now. It passed on the ballot in a California city last year with 73%, Albany, California. And it results in almost every voter not only having those choices that ranked choice voting provides and having the candidate opportunities to consider, but actually having a very good chance of helping elect someone. So you get legislative bodies that fully reflect the votes of people. And I think that conversation about winner take all versus a more inclusive representation system is one that would be healthy for our country and really help sort of structurally and in a persistent way kind of address poor representation.
Thank you. And I see we have a few more questions coming in. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Maybe I'll start here and with Maria, for those who fear third-party candidates or extremists, which I think are two very different things. What can you say about the impact of ranked choice voting on either making it easier for third-party candidates or, you know, being able to not make it as easy for folks who are more on the fringes?
Yeah, I'll start with the second part of that question in terms of extreme candidates, right? On any side of the spectrum. It is, as we see in our political climate right now, it is not difficult for extreme candidates to build a strong base of support, no matter where on the spectrum you are, right? So in a first past the post kind of a system, it is not hard to see how an extreme candidate can really just get, you know, a few hundred more votes than somebody else and just take a seat. Because we are living in very polarized times and there's some like extreme thinking going on. Ranked choice voting really helps with that issue because in order to win, especially in a crowded race, right? If you have like 5-6 candidates, it is almost impossible for somebody to win with just first choice votes. A super extreme candidate, again, no matter where on the political spectrum they are, it's going to be very difficult for them to get a lot of second choice or third choice votes from other, from voters who prefer another candidate, right? So they may come up fairly strong on the first count of voting, but as candidates start getting eliminated, those voters that chose those other candidates are not likely to have chosen them as their second choice because they don't align on values, they don't align on policy, and you know, often the extreme candidates do not campaign positively, so they count on personal attacks against their opponents to garner support of their you know, first choice voters. The way that I look at this is in you know, non-ranked choice voting election, candidates look, it's kind of like a Venn diagram, right? It's like my voters, somebody else's voters, and then there's a little tiny sliver that is where the Venn diagram overlaps, which is the undecided or movable voters. And those are the voters that these candidates are going to go for. Outreach, talk to, call, a lot of you know, investment in a tiny sliver of the electorate. In ranked choice voting, it's more like concentric circles, right? It's like my voters, those are the voters that are going to rank me number one. But then the circle outside of that is like other candidates' voters who would like to have me as their backup choice and so forth. So it really incentivizes candidates to reach out to all voters or most voters and try to get those second and third choice votes, which is really not an advantage for candidates with really extreme views. As far as third party, I think that it just opens up a possibility for third party candidates to run without being told that they're ruining everything, which is, you know, the conversation we have in this country, unfortunately. It's like there's two teams, and if you're from another team, you're just told to back off and not ruin everything. That doesn't really seem like democracy to me, right? Like more voices at the table, more ideas of what might be good for a community should be welcome and not chastised or punished. So I think that a system like ranked choice voting really opens up the ability for third or minor party candidates to have their platform discussed at the table.
Thank you for that. And Mayor, if I could come back to you with, there's a question following up maybe on Maria's points earlier about voter education, which we talked about a lot, but there's also, of course, a candidate education and consultant education. I think that goes into this. What would you say about, the things that are important there and what you would recommend in places both, about this education kind of in the process of trying to change your system to pass something new, and once it's passed in terms of folks who are going to be on the ballot?
Yeah, so in the case of St. Louis, when approval voting passed, it literally passed in November, early November, at the same time as the presidential election, and filing for the next mayor's election opened 3 weeks later. So we were literally building this plane as we were flying it. So I think, but also, to the point about education, as we were talking to all of the voters, right, we canvassed every ward across the city actually 3 times. And we often went into areas where we knew we were not liked, but would try to convince people that if I can't be your first choice, then make me your second choice, or letting people know that they could vote for more than one candidate when we would see, signs of our opponents in their yards, and just continuing to knock on those doors and saying, you can vote for more than one candidate in this election. And a lot of times they were surprised and say, really, isn't that breaking the rules? No, and it wasn't. And I think people appreciated that. If they liked more than one candidate in the election and they got an opportunity to vote for more than one candidate, and the results showed that.
Thank you for that. I think we have time maybe for one more of our Q&A. And I do want to make sure before we conclude, we ask Rob and Maria for just some thoughts about what's going to happen next and what to look for in New York here over the next few hours and weeks. But there's a follow-up question here about the issue we were talking about in terms of minority representation, and about some concern about minorities being less likely to submit a second or third choice. Is that true? I mean, in which case it could reduce their influence, or do you feel like that's not the case and actually gives them the opportunity to vote for more candidates and that they want to do that?
Yeah, the report I sent a link to in response to the query is that one that was quite encouraging for us. I think it's often tied to the number of candidates people want to vote for, right? And so I think when you have more candidates who are attracted to voters of color, they will rank more, but that's not always the case, and so it depends. But I think certainly we aren't seeing adverse impacts on outcomes in racially diverse districts. In the Bay Area, the biggest jump where people of color were winning was in districts that were plurality white. So whites were the single biggest racial group, but not a majority. And it's those districts where I think having a diversity of candidates, diversity of voters, ranked choice voting really handled that very well, and shows that people were in fact using their rankings. I'll just say quickly on New York is we will get most outcomes will be pretty definitive today. One way to think about ranked choice voting when it gets down to 2, so they run that tally, right, where last person is out, you reduce the field, you get down to 2. If the margin is 9% or something significant, absentee ballots, which are about more than 100,000 votes still in New York still to count out of a total of almost 1 million, but they can only affect that much of a margin. But if it's a 2% margin, then let's wait, and they won't report the absentee totals in the final RCV totals till next week. It's just taking a while, and they're very careful. It's like making sure every vote gets treated. People can come in and cure their absentee ballot if there's an issue, and they're just trying to. These are practices designed to make votes count, and in a close race that can affect outcomes. But I think we will know in the great majority of races who their winner is by the end of the evening.
Thank you. And Maria, do you have any final takeaways on what we've seen in New York and what you think it means for the future of these efforts?
I want to touch a little bit on this question about voters of color actually engaging fully with their ballot. I mean, Rob mentioned this exit poll that Common Cause New York did, shows that there really isn't a difference between how folks interacted with their ballot according to ethnicity. I want to give a huge shout out to Common Cause New York, Susan Lerner, and to Rank the Vote NYC. Sean Duger was the person leading that voter education campaign in New York City. They did a phenomenal job. They had organizers in every borough. They had organizers working with communities in a number of languages. They had their materials and their presentations, their trainings in a number of different languages. And so that is the trick, right? We know that that voter turnout tends to be higher as folks get older, whiter, richer. So that outreach to voters that are younger and browner in neighborhoods that don't usually get outreach to is key. Once people are engaged, they will vote. They know how to do it. There's not, you know, a ranked ballot is not something that is hard for people to engage with. People just need to be invested in, right? Like communities need to be invested in, whether they are high turnout type of communities, and particularly if they're a low turnout type of communities. If folks feel like their vote's going to count, they're going to turn out, they're going to vote, they're going to know how to, they're going to rank their ballot. They're you know, they will know what to do if people spend a little time in, investing in that voter education. So I think that more and more we're going to see that there isn't really, you know, that's not a true statement that voters of color are not going to rank or don't know how to rank, or, you know, I think that's an unfortunate narrative that is out there. As far as New York, I mean, I'm looking forward to the results. I think that no matter what happens, it was an incredible thing that folks pulled off in New York right now in terms of actually implementing this, the voter education, the candidate education. It's amazing. I can't even believe that people pulled it off. It's huge, right? New York City is bigger than many states, and they did this without really without a hiccup.
Well, thank you. As I know we're running short on time for a great conversation, Mayor, Rob, and Maria, really appreciate your time. This is, as we've been saying, such a timely topic with all that's going on, and I think a lot more to come on this, and look forward to staying in touch with all of you. Thank you to everyone who joined in the discussion. Also, just a special shout out. I know Rob mentioned Rebecca earlier, former state representative in Utah, New Deal alum, doing fantastic work out there on strengthening democracy in Utah and setting a model for the country. So again, just thank you to everyone who's joined. Please stay tuned. We will have more programming to come in our democracy series. Obviously, there's a lot going on, kind of the good and the bad, and we will try to address as much of it as we can. So stay tuned for more programming. Mark your calendar for our return to in-person events at our fall conference, November 17th to 19th in Washington, D.C., and hope to talk to you all again real soon. Thanks so much.